Hi there, this is Matt with ot3d.org. This video is part of a series of videos that I'm making designed to teach occupational therapy practitioners, educators, and students about applications for 3D printing in practice. My goal is to provide videos, resources, and instructional templates that will help walk you through the process of using a 3D printer. In this video, we're going to take a quick look at some of the different tools and skills that are beneficial if you're using a 3D printer. The tools and skills presented in this video can help you to improve your prints and open new opportunities as you learn the process. To provide a quick overview of the video, we'll be talking about tools that are used for measuring, tools that are used for finishing up prints and improving them, tools that are actually used to help your printer if it has any issues, and finally we'll be talking a little bit about applications for electronics in 3D printing. So the first topic that we'll be covering is tools that are used to help you measure. So measuring is a vital part of 3D printing. If you're designing an object, if you're wanting to print something, you can use a straight-up ruler to help you get a size reference so that you understand how big something is going to be when it prints out, because looking at it on a computer screen sometimes doesn't give the full picture. The next thing you might want to consider, in addition to that straight ruler that's very useful for those flat surfaces, is something that can measure round surfaces. So a fabric measuring tape, which is something that as OTs we might be familiar with, can be used to measure round surfaces. This is something that if you are wanting to work with prosthetics or just general rounded surfaces, very useful to have for measuring. Now the last thing that I want to talk about in the measuring category is something that is useful for measuring very small things. So a set of digital calipers, like I have pictured here, can give me very exact measurements in 3 different ways. I can measure how wide something is, how big a space is, or how deep something is using these, which is incredibly helpful if you're starting to model something. So the next category that we'll be talking about is finishing. So after you've printed something, it may have supports on it, it may not look quite the way that you want it. So what we're going to talk about is ways that we can improve a print after it's done printing. So the first thing that we'll talk about is sandpaper. Now there are many different kinds of sandpaper out there. With 3D printing, typically you're going to want to go for a higher grit because we're just going to be smoothing out the surface, cleaning up any divots that are left over. You can actually use wet sandpaper as well. I found on resin prints, using wet sandpaper is a really good way to smooth it out if you have any imperfections or divots left by supports. With FDM prints, you might use a little bit lower and then finish with the higher grit sandpaper in the end. The next thing that we'll be talking about is a tool that actually comes with a lot of 3D printers. It's a set of flush cutters. So these are one of my favorite tools. They're very useful for removing supports. I highly recommend them. You can use them to snip, and it cuts a straight line. You can also use them as kind of a prying tool, although that's probably not recommended. It's what I end up using them for quite a bit. Also tweezers for getting supports out of small areas. They can come in very useful, especially a very strong set of tweezers. In the same vein of removing things, you might actually consider using a rotary tool or a Dremel. This is essentially just a very fast spinning bit, and they'll have attachments for sandpaper, for little grinding stones, so you can actually shape the print after it's done. Just be aware that the faster it goes, the more heat it generates, and you might end up melting the print if you go too fast or too heavy. If you have any gaps in your 3D print, you might consider the use of a 3D pen. So a 3D pen is essentially the same thing as an FDM printer, except that you can guide it with your hand. Now the benefit of this is if you have any gaps in your 3D print or rough edges that you want to kind of smooth out, or if you take off too much using that Dremel from earlier, you can fill it in with that 3D pen using the same filament that you use in your printer. These are especially useful for lower temperature filaments like PLA. 3D pens probably won't be able to handle those higher temperature filaments if you're doing something in PETG or ASA, but for PLA prints they are excellent for doing that sort of thing. Now if you have any scuff marks or just kind of chipped edges, especially with like PLA prints, you can use a heat gun, which is something as OTs we might be familiar with. You can actually use this to heat up those areas, to clean up the surface of it a little bit by literally melting it. You can use this to kind of shape prints after they're complete, because remember, these are thermoplastics, similar to what we'd be using in a hand therapy clinic. You can also use them to add metal. I've used this to add screws a couple times. It's an excellent tool. And the very last thing for finishing that I'd like to talk about is after we've maybe sanded, we can actually paint most of our prints. So if you're limited to printing in one color and you want to have it be a different color for visual awareness or any other reason, I would recommend using something called a filler primer that will smooth out the print as you spray it on. It sprays on just like a spray paint. And after that's dry, you can sand it down to get that smooth surface, and then use your regular colored spray paint just to cover it up. It'll give you a nice finish just about every time. Now, if you are going to be doing spray paint, of course use spray paint in a well-ventilated area. Your neighbors in the office or suite that you are in may not appreciate the fumes coming from your workstation. Now, in the resin video that I made, we briefly touched on this, but if you're doing resin prints, one of the tools that you might consider getting is something called a curing station. This one right here that I have at the local makerspace takes care of both washing and an alcohol bath. It has a little motor at the bottom that spins and stirs up the alcohol to wash off the prints, and it also takes care of curing with the UV lights. It rotates it kind of like a microwave so that all of the surfaces are evenly exposed. Taking care of resin prints without a curing station is going to be a lot more time consuming, so I'd highly recommend investing in one of these stations if you're going to be doing resin printing in any kind of volume. So up next, let's talk a little bit about tools that are helpful for printer maintenance. So printers will occasionally need maintenance. One of the things that you'll commonly run into is a clog. So if you run into a clog with your printer, it may be under extruding, not putting enough plastic out. What you can use is actually one of these declogging tools. A lot of times if you heat it up and you're able to take this little pin and push it in, you can kind of move the clog around until it touches on that heated surface and melts the way it was supposed to. If this doesn't work, there are a couple other options. Most 3D printers are going to come with a set of wrenches or tools, and you are actually able to take the brass nozzle off. Just be sure to follow the instruction manual or a trustworthy online video for your specific printer on how to do this. And with that in mind, you may want to consider investing in a couple of spare parts. One thing that I happen to keep on hand a lot of the time is an extra set of brass nozzles. They're relatively cheap. You can get quite a few for under $5, and it's a good backup piece to have if it starts to wear out, especially if you're doing something that's going to be more demanding, like having a metal filament or a glow-in-the-dark filament. With resin printers, this may look like having extra screens. With resin printers, you can do this as well. Having backup screens for the bottom of the resin vat is a very useful thing to have. And with both types of printers, I will say one of the most useful tools that you will get is an Allen key. So these little L-shaped Allen keys are super useful to have. Most printers are put together with these. You can tighten things, you can loosen things, make adjustments if you need to. Be sure to keep one of these on hand that fits your printer. I briefly touched on this in some of the other guides that I've made, but one other thing that you may want to have next to your printer with your printer, if you are using filaments that have trouble sticking to the surface, there's a couple different things that you can use, like hairspray, glue sticks, blue painter's tape. I personally have had the best success with glue sticks and blue painter's tape, especially when I'm printing on glass. It gives me that nice smooth surface, but it doesn't always stick the way I want it to. So using those kinds of tools, just as like a standby if you're having trouble getting print adhesion, can be a useful tool. So the final thing that we'll be talking about today as far as skills and tools go is soldering equipment. So if you're familiar with some of the projects that I've done using files from Makers Making Change, you may know about the switches that I've made, which get electronics involved. So just like with 3D printing, soldering, or the process of using metal solder and heat to join electrical components, this may seem intimidating at first, but with a little practice and by following video guides, you can pick up this as a very useful extra skill. I recently used it when I was making this raindrop switch right here that can be used in combination with switch adapted toys like this little ladybug right here. You can see him walking around. Truthfully, this was probably my third attempt at making this switch look nice and making sure it worked, so don't get let down if it's not perfect the first time. I'm actually going to link an excellent instructional video down below because this, again, is something that I'm relatively new to, but it's going to walk you through the process of how all the tools are used, what they look like, and the soldering process as a whole. So that'll just about wrap up the video on these helpful tools and skills that can be used in conjunction with 3D printing. I hope that you found this video useful. If you'd like the associated instructional guide that goes along with this, it'll be located on ot3d.org alongside this video. If you have any questions, feel free to comment them in the YouTube video below and I'll try to get back to you. And happy printing!